So we're very pleased to welcome today Dr. Hélène Seiler, who is a French coach, but who is based in the US, an executive coach and supervisor who's been working for 25 years in the coaching and leadership development arena. So although, as I said, born in France, you've lived and worked in North America, Western Europe and Southeast Asia. So very widely traveled and experienced about coaching people in different cultures. And you have, you're an MCC coach with ICF, and you're also now a doctor because you have a doctorate in coaching and mentoring from the Oxford Brookes University. And that is really what sparked me to reach out to you, was your doctorate, which is in, how to ask for feedback from our executive clients, which I feel is something that isn't always easy for us to do as coaches. And so, as I said, I'm very pleased that you accepted our invitation to share with us today that research and how we can actually go about getting real feedback from our clients. Okay? So with that, I shall hand the floor over to Hélène, and we look forward to seeing what you're going to share with us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jo. I want to say it's been a pleasure getting to know you in preparing this webinar, and thank you for everyone who is participating today. There will be time for questions throughout the webinar, and of course sometimes all questions are not answered because of time, so you are more than welcome to contact me. You can find me on LinkedIn, or Jo can also share my email if you want to send me an email. Yeah. I'm going to start just by giving you some context why I got interested in this topic in the first place. And so what I'd like to say is that I have been a practitioner pretty much full-time since 2005. And from the very start, I started receiving a lot of feedback from assessors, especially as I was going through the stages of the ICF certification. Trainers, when I became a coach, I attended a coaching school, and also from sponsors of coaching. So I would be rated, after coaching engagement. And I found that all very nice, but I just couldn't make any use of it. Because, when somebody tells me, oh, you did very well, or the client puts you a 5 out of 5, or when I was told, you passed or you didn't pass such and such exam, it was very difficult for me to get to the bottom of things. So what could I have done differently in order to reach a better outcome? Or much simpler, what did I do well and need to do again, if I had a very good rating? So that was sort of in my head. And then, so I decided to do a doctorate, which main part is a research project. And when I started my research project, I was invited to think about my theory, my espouse theory of coaching. And as I reflected on various theories and where they were coming from, I came across the distinction in research between pragmatism, positivism, and postmodernism. And I want to say a little bit about this because I think for us coaches, it's important to know where we belong. So I want to give you an example of positivist research. This is this. I don't know if you're aware, but the ICF, they have just issued a list of competencies. This is a positivist approach because they believe that the truth lies in the experts. In other words, they have interviewed 1,300 coaches, and using a very elaborate technique called job analysis, this is a positivist approach. So there is a truth somewhere, and we're going to ask people to tell us what it is, the experts. Then a postmodernist approach in coaching would be anything can do, So it's basically anybody can become a coach. You don't need any training. Every situation is different. So that's another way of looking at it. And then there are the pragmatists like me who think that you come to the truth in dialogue. But I'm the old-fashioned kind of pragmatist. So the one that was created in the first quarter of the 20th century by actually Americans thinker like Dewey. Well, I think that we ground the dialogue in evidence. So I am an evidence-based coach, but I also believe that it's a partnership with the client. And I'm not an expert. Or I could say we are both experts, but we come together with the client in order to make something happen. So that's important because this is how I came up with the idea of the client feedback instrument. I don't believe that I am a magician or an artist or a super elaborate scholar. I believe that I will co-construct the truth with my client. So that is why I proposed to engage in studying client feedback. So just to give you a little bit of context. So now, just to warm us up, I think, so actually, let's see, it doesn't seem to work. Oh yes, here we go. So we have some polls coming up, and I think now, Joe, is your chance to shine. I think we're going to try to do a poll and find out if you ask your clients for feedback. So yeah, never, from time to time, frequently, or always. So let's see what you guys come up with. I'll give you a few minutes. So there is
a couple of people haven't voted yet. Almost.
Okay, so
I haven't voted. I don't think I can actually vote. So yeah, everybody voted.
I don't know.
The numbers going up and down.
That's funny.
So maybe people are changing their mind. Okay, I think that's probably where we're going to land. Can you see the results, or do I have to press this for end polling?
I don't know. I mean, I just see.
I'm going to try.
Right now.
Okay. Okay, that's the results. I shall share the results.
Okay. Wow, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So that's excellent. So now we are. So I'm just trying to find out how to do this. So now, what do you ask feedback on? Do you ask feedback on your impact? So it's called summative feedback. Or do you ask feedback about what you did or did not do during the session, or both?
Okay, has everybody voted? I will share the results. There we go.
Both. Excellent. So I'm done. We're done. I've got an enlightened participants here, enlightened participant. That's wonderful. So great. So I want to introduce quickly, because you seem to know what I'm talking about, an example of formative feedback. And actually, the formative feedback is very developed the other way around. This is an example not of a coach receiving formative feedback, but a client receiving formative feedback. It's an example of a 360 from the Center of Creative Leadership. And you can see that it is behaviorally based. So there's a competency, a number of behaviors, and people are asked, to what extent did that person display the behavior? And of course, the choice of behaviors is based on what we think will be effective. So that's the formative feedback example. And now the summative feedback example, is something that I'm sure you've had. And I don't know, I have these blue lines on my slides,
Yeah.
so I'm not sure where it's coming from, but it doesn't prevent anybody to read. Maybe I did this myself by mistake. I have no idea. It's possible. So I don't know. I hope it's not too distracting. It could have been me moving my
I don't know.
Anyways, so this is an example of summative feedback where basically how beneficial did you find the coaching? And this is what made me so frustrated, because I'm sure that some of you recognize something that you get sometimes from the sponsor. And it's very useful in the sense that, you know, it lets you know whether or not you've done your job, but it doesn't really help you know what this is that you need to do better. So I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each type of feedback. Of course, the summative feedback, and again, I'm focusing on client, summative feedback is very effective for the client, because especially if they get to experience your coaching positively, that's going to likely reinforce their trust. And we know, I mean, many research has shown that if the client trusts you more, the client is more likely to experience the benefits of coaching over time. So it's a very powerful thing, and certainly should not go away. But the principal issue with summative feedback is that it has not been linked to an improvement in job performance. So if you keep getting summative feedback, studies show that you are pretty much unlikely to demonstrate any progress. Okay. The other thing with summative feedback, that it is a black box in a way. It can be dismissed, and it can lead to perpetuating behaviors that are not helpful, that are not effective. And so there's a danger to that as well. So formative feedback has been definitely linked to job performance in many, many studies. It is especially effective if and that sounds like, that sounds obvious, but it has been proved in research, if the feedback giver is actually knowledgeable about your job, right? If they know what you do. So here comes the first objections from positivists. Well, the clients don't know. So how could they give us feedback? Yeah, they don't know what they're talking about. So that is actually interesting, and I'm going to talk to that. I'm going to try to rebut that as much as I can in this slide. So the client is, of course, only one of a number of different stakeholders, and I put them in here. So the assessors, which are on the upper left, are accrediting bodies such as ICF, or schools when they assess you. The sponsors are the ones who are paying for coaching, and they usually have some scorecard. The supervisors, and on the bottom left, the client. So the sponsors, what we know from research is that they actually are not that passionate or interested about surveying the effectiveness of coaching for a very simple reason. Coaching represents less than 0.5% of their investment in leadership and development. So, you know, if an executive coaching engagement doesn't go that well, actually it's okay as long as the client is satisfied. They're not going to measure that much. They don't have the time. It's very complicated. And again, it's a drop in the expense that they have in leadership development. The problems with assessors and supervisors, and again, this comes from research, is that there is a tendency to be biased and over-rely on their own model. And that has been observed, for example, when experts are assessing coaches in research settings, they tend to rely on their own model and see the entire coaching session through the prism of their model. So while their feedback is useful, it is biased, and it has been measured usually different from the feedback from clients and the self-feedback from coaches in research. The client in research settings, again, has been the one the closest to the coach evaluation repeatedly. So what they think about what you did well and did not do well is really pretty close to what you think you did well and did not do so well. The problem is when coaches refuse to inform their clients about what they do. So if coaches are transparent from the start, if they explain what they're doing, then the feedback is going to be similar. But if they take the mantle of expertise and they trust me, I'm not going to tell you what I do, just, you know, follow the rules and you will be fine. And I'm talking about the coaching process here. Then what's going to happen is the client is going to shy away from giving feedback and may even misinterpret mistakes that you make as part of the proposed process. So one example, you might have a very direct approach to coaching because maybe you've been trained with say Julio Olala in South America, who is very, very direct when he gives feedback to his clients or when he interacts with his client. And that will make the client very uncomfortable, but they think, you know, it's okay to be uncomfortable. Maybe that's part of what he wants. And actually that was not your intention. You did not want to make the client uncomfortable, and the client isn't really able to express himself or herself. It started from a good intention. You were following a model. The client wasn't sure, you know, whether or not that was normal to feel uncomfortable. At the end of the day, we know from research it is absolutely not the right way to go. So good intention, bad impact. And as you perpetuate your beliefs because you're not getting the right feedback from your client, and again, that's been measured in research, your assessment of the coaching session and that of the client are going to be increasingly different. So there is, in other words, a real danger in not checking with your clients and saying, how did that impact you? And the client might say, well, I feel uncomfortable. Tell me exactly what I did. Well, in the way you expressed yourself, it felt very directive, and okay, so let's try and do this differently. So these are some of the things that were coming out of research. So before I go any further, I just wanted to ask if there were any questions about client feedback in general, the business case for client feedback, anything that you would like to ask at this stage.
Okay, so thank you, Hélène. Does anybody have a question? You can type it in the chat box. Or I think you can possibly raise your hand, but I still can't see that option on here. So maybe just type it in the chat box if you have a question. Yes, I have a question from Gabriella saying, how and when do you ask for client feedback?
So Gabriella, this is an excellent question, and I will address this before the end of the call. So absolutely, we'll answer that question.
Okay, do we have any other questions so far? Nothing so far, Hélène.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
I will, thank you. So, so this slide is just to give you a very quick overview of how I conducted my research. And the important thing for me was that, so I wanted to build a client feedback scale. And I started by looking at all the competency models that have been produced, realizing that none of them had ever involved clients. And again, the ICF is a case in point. 1,300 coaches, not a single client. And so I had to start my research by convening focus groups of clients and ask them to review and revise the list that I put together based on scouting, researching existing competency models. Once the focus group came with a shortened list of behaviors, I then surveyed clients at the end of the coaching process, and I asked them 2 sets of questions. First of all, I asked them whether or to what extent their coach I engage in the different behaviors that had been selected by the focus groups. And secondly, I asked them a few questions about the impact of the coaching process. And so this led me to conduct a number of statistical analysis. Factor analysis, or rather principal component analysis, allowed me to group these behaviors, try to make sense of what they represented. And then multiple regressions allowed me to find out whether these behaviors were actually linked to some coaching outcomes. By the way, this was the first time anyone had ever done this. Again, the ICF competency model has not been tested, so there is no test of whether or not it is linked to coaching outcomes. So it's what we call criterion validity. We don't know. So this will give you some overall results, and then I will go into detail. So when I approached my focus groups, I came to them with 89 behaviors, and I asked them to reduce the list of behaviors. Only, I mean, there was one technical reason. It was principal component analysis. You know, the more behavior you have, the more participants you need. So I was also limited by the number of participants I could get. But also, I already wanted them to tell me, reflecting on the outcome of their coaching process, because I have to say something that I didn't say before. These were experienced clients of coaching. So they had had coaching before, some of them several times. There were about 25 of these people participating in these focus groups. And so I asked them to reflect on whether or not these behaviors in their mind had been conducive to effective coaching. And so that helped them reduce the pool as well. And so what we found out is that 35 behaviors were in the end retained, and only half of them were pretty much retained as such, the way they were phrased in the coaching competency models where they came from. Some of them were retained but significantly modified, and they also added a few that were not in the original competency models from the ICF and the likes. One of the main things that came out of this exercise was that the focus group participants really wanted to change the expression of behaviors into a participatory expression. So for example, they wanted me to say, invited me to, rather than asked about. So the idea being, the coach is not the expert. The coach has to check with the clients whether or not this proposed process is going to work for them. So the client has to trust that the coach has to trust that the client is actually knowledgeable. Now think of it. When you coach an executive client, don't you think they're knowledgeable already? These people have direct reports. They already coach. So it would be extremely presumptuous to think as a coach, an executive coach, that you know more than your clients. And so this is what they told me. And it resonated profoundly for me, because that's also what I've experienced as a coach, even though, I've been in the game for many years. I still learn from my clients every day. So I think it's an important part of what I discovered with these focus groups.
We
now,
do have, sorry, we do have a comment from Gael, if I can just interrupt, saying that what you're proposing means the coach has to be vulnerable, and that it's not that easy, particularly at the beginning of the coaching journey, for the coach to do that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and she's asking if we can have some examples maybe of the behaviors that were.
Yeah, so we will. So I think there are two different things here. One is about the vulnerability of the coach. It's an excellent question, Gael, because as I'm reflecting more and more about this, you know, when you begin your coaching journey, I think it probably makes more sense to fake it a little bit, you know, and go with the book. As you grow in your coaching journey, you actually grow in vulnerability. So towards the end, you are completely transparent and vulnerable, you know, of your coaching journey. But at the beginning, I think you are more guarded, and it makes perfect sense. However, you can be guarded, but you can also be aware of these behaviors that the clients want and try to display them. So I'm totally with you there. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it reflects the arch of the development of the ICF credentialing. Absolutely. So now, what are these behaviors? So when I did the principal component analysis based on the frequency of behaviors, I actually was not that surprised, which is good, because I recognize the model that many of us use. The circle around is called empathy. So these are the foundational behaviors, and I will go into depth into the different types of empathy in a bit. And the behaviors that came out represented a process of transformational learning. And I put professional in there because what really came out was that it was really embedded in the organization. So a lot of the behaviors were about the coach making sure that the executive coaching process is grounded in the needs of the organization and aligned with the needs of the organization. And that's the essence of executive coaching. And that might be what differentiates it from strictly life coaching or personal coaching. So professional transformational learning, represented by a cycle. I don't think you will be surprised by any of this. I will go in detail. Preparatory behaviors, creativity behaviors, goal alignment behaviors, and maintenance of trust. And again, this idea that, you know, the coaching process is circular, and it's also a complex adaptive system. So as you know, the discussion continue between the client and the coach, you sometimes have to go back to preparatory behavior, go backwards and forwards to adjust as the coaching process unfolds. So I am going to now go into detail of each of these behaviors, groups of behaviors. So empathy, I found different types of empathy in there. And I think it's important to distinguish the different kinds of empathy. Cognitive empathy was definitely in there, and cognitive empathy are these behaviors where the coach aims at deeply understanding the emotions of the client. So it's the deep understanding and being able to label the emotion that the client is going through. And it goes hand in hand with sharing empathy. which is the ability of the coach to effectively share, either through a metaphor or through a word or any other device, the actual emotion that they have witnessed or noticed. So that's the second aspect of the empathy. And then the third one is the nurturing empathy, where the coach is, now that these emotions have been acknowledged by both parties, the coach is now able to accept them and to be non-judgmental and to be a safe space for the client. What is not there is the fourth kind of empathy, which is called affective empathy, where the coach actually shares the same emotion. So he finds or she finds herself in the same emotion. So I want to give you a few words there that, you know, actual behaviors. My coach stayed non-judgmental. My coach acknowledged my emotions when discussing a topic. When I presented an issue, my coach neither overreacted nor stayed overly neutral. And so that's the ability of the coach to be a container, and to really not overdo it or underdo it. So these were the main findings from these empathic behaviors. Now let's look at the professional transformational behaviors. So the preparation behaviors are, we usually refer to them as assessment. What is really important in this scale is that the clients put particular emphasis on the coach understanding the organizational system. So a few examples of these behaviors. My coach checked if their understanding of my organization was sufficient to discuss the issue I presented. So it is very important for the coach to be knowledgeable about the organization, and that really came out during the focus groups very strongly. We do not believe, I was told, that an executive coach can be effective if they don't understand the business we are in. So that was a big finding in the preparation behaviors. Next one, the creativity behaviors. So this one was counterintuitive for some. The role of the coach as a provider of serendipitous connection, so an enabler of serendipitous connection in the brain of the client by injecting substance. In other words, creativity behaviors include informing behaviors. The coach is expected to share examples, advice, knowledge. So as much as the coach is requested to be sharing and inviting the client to be part of the process, the coach is also invited to be part of the substance. So it goes completely counterintuitive with what we learn, which is usually use a tool, trust the process, never ever give any advice to the client. Well, no. It depends. And if you want your clients to become creative, you're going to have to perturb the system of the client. Therefore, you're going to have to share some knowledge. So just to give you an example of what the behaviors could be, my coach used examples from their own life story to illustrate a point I made. Another thing that is important is that it's something that is not done immediately. So, for example, when I requested advice, my coach checked first if this is what I really needed, and then invited me to reflect on my request. So the idea is that you don't do it automatically. It's a dance, And there is a scholar who wrote beautifully about this, is Manfred de Vries, who compares coaching as a jazz improvisation set, where the instruments respond to each other and inject some substance to the music, and they can then create something beautiful out of it. So this was a very important part of what the clients were asking for. Then there were the goal alignment behaviors. So I did not call them goal setting, because what appeared from the discussions and the research was that the clients did really not want their coach to babysit them. They did not want their coach to tell them, okay, can you now tell me what you're going to do tomorrow? Shall I send you a WhatsApp message to check if you have done it? That was of no interest to them. However, they wanted to be challenged in the sense of, does it make sense? So does this goal make sense in terms of my career in the organization? Are my goals even aligned with the strategy of the organization? Is where I want to go where the organization wants to go? So very, very systemic, rather than being sort of babysitting goal-setting behaviors. So what I want to say also there, because the last time I presented this was in Lyon. So I was invited to present in a coaching school. And the other presenter was a young man who presented a system to do artificial intelligence coaching. Okay, so basically you are coached by a machine. Okay, so it didn't work, but what worked was that the system was able to send reminders about, you know, when should you do this, when should you do that, and it made me think that maybe this part of the coaching process is not really the value added of the coach. So babysitting goals is probably the job of a machine and not the job of a human. So if we are talking about artificial intelligence, maybe that's the thing we can start outsourcing first. So finally, another group of behaviors is managing ruptures of trust. So this one is very important because, as you may have experienced, coaching is not always an easy process. And sometimes, even if you are on your best intention, and I shared an example before, the client can lose trust in you, and you have to call it out. You have to make sure that everything is okay for the client. And that is part of the transformational learning process. If a client is scared, then it's unlikely that they will learn well. So there were also behaviors around managing ruptures of trust. A typical example is, when a client becomes concerned about confidentiality, for example. How can you reassure, or how can you recontract with your client? So these are the behaviors, the groups of behaviors that came out. I want to pause here and ask if there are any questions about the behavior types that came up out of the research.
Okay, thank you, Hélène. There's a comment from Julie who says it's a form of co-creation with the client regarding the creativity aspect of the coaching experience. So confirmation of that, which is, I think, when you mentioned about it being a dance. And Armel also wanted to know the name of the coach who wrote about coaching being a jazz improvisation. So I think it was Manfred de Vries.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I'm actually, as I speak, I'm going to check something. Yeah, so if you have my article, you will see it is referenced at the very bottom of the article. It's called Coaching Good Hour, Creating Tipping Points. And so you'll see the exact article I'm referring to.
I will be sharing that article after the webinar.
Excellent. So perfect.
Yeah. So do we have any other questions about these behaviors that Hélène has shared with us? I must say I was very surprised about the idea of yes, giving advice, as you put it, of actually having an input directly into the content as such of the coaching, because yes, that's not what we normally hear when we're being trained as coaches.
Right, right. And I think, you know, I've had this discussion with a number of people, and I think again there's somebody was referring to the arc, you know, at the beginning of becoming a coach, and I'm sure you've seen that with your clients too. There's a tendency to want to give too much advice, and so maybe it's good to start holding back, but you can't hold back too much, because if you do, your client is unlikely to experience the cognitive change that is an inherent part of the inherent part of the coaching process. So it is scary, and I think the best way to do this when you are beginning is to ask, you know, and say, I wonder if it would be useful at this stage that I share an experience that I've had, or that I share, you know, something I know from my previous job, or something that, you know, I've noticed after having coached a number of executives in your sector, and just see how it lands.
Yes, so in fact, that's what Gabriella and Julie have just commented. So Gabriella says it's interesting how clients want the content, but only after checking. We have to check first if they're willing to receive that, as Julie says, so it's important to ask for permission each time.
Yeah, and I think she's alluding that, you know, the contracting process is so important, and that's also going to help to that question, you know, that I had before. How do you do it, right? How do you ask for feedback?
Yes.
And it's that idea that, you know, you contract with your client at the beginning of the coaching session, but you also contract with your client all the time. And the way these clients actually express the behavior, they're always asking the coach to contract. It's always, invited me to do this or that, and then I can say yes or no. Ask me if I wanted to do this or that, and the clients can say yes or no. And actually the yes or no can be a perfect platform to ask, wow, I'm curious, why is that not possible, you know? So I want to give you a quick example. So just 2 weeks ago I started a coaching engagement project. And so we are in the contracting phase. I actually spent a full hour doing that. I've got my first coaching session is 100% contracted. And we talked about, you know, the process, and I said, well, usually I invite, you know, a few stakeholders for interviews, and I also invite your boss, you know, to come in once you have set some goals to find out, you know, how it lands on her or him. And she said, oh no, we can't do that. I said, okay, so what's going on? And she said, oh no, he's too busy. And so I say, wow, that's interesting. So off we went into a coaching session that was about the relationship between her and her boss. And so that, you know, every contracting piece is an opportunity to coach, platform to coach. So so that's that. Any other questions about the behaviors before I continue? Joe, is there anything else?
No, we just have a comment from Gael saying, so it's maybe we have to take care of the balance between sharing experience and containing self-exploration.
Yeah, yeah.
Then we have a comment from Julie saying, because at the point of yes, no, the client remains responsible for their own solutions based on their experience, so not that of the coach. So it's more empowering once we asked if we're allowed to share or not. And then Armel says, giving feedback and giving advice is quite different. With a question mark.
Oh, absolutely. And so what we're talking about is the injection of substance from the coach to the client. So we're now talking about the coach giving feedback to the client, which is another way of informing the client. And so absolutely, I agree. There are many, many ways you can inform the client, one of which is to give feedback, and another one is to give information that is available to you and not necessarily to the client. Absolutely. Yeah. And typically informing behaviors are feedback behaviors are accepted because they come from someone else. I mean, or the coach may have observed something in the moment during the coaching session. They may have observed something. It's different from, absolutely different from giving advice.
Okay, we just have a further comment from Julie saying that she likes the idea of injecting substance into the coaching process.
Yeah, and I think there's, again, you'll see the reference when you receive the article. There is a Canadian researcher by the name of, now I can't remember her first name, but her last name is Marquis, and she researched creativity as the emergence of serendipitous connections in the brain. And that really inspired me. And I actually, that's a perfect transition to my next slide, because I actually chose her scale to measure the impact of coaching. So that's the next scale. So these are the results of my multiple regression analysis. So you remember, I also asked the survey participants what sort of outcome they had experienced, right? And so I was able to measure the relationships between the scale developed by the clients and the various outcomes. So to measure the outcome, I used an adapted Kirkpatrick model. It is traditionally used to measure the impact of learning initiative, and it has been adapted to coaching. And there are 4 levels. The first one is reaction and satisfaction with the coaching process. The second one is cognitive change. The third is behavioral change. And the last one is impact of the organization. So in terms of the level 1, I use the working alliance. It's a scale, so the strength of the working alliance from the perspective of the client. It has been used traditionally in psychotherapy. It has been adapted to coaching actually by a French guy, Marquis, and you will again be able to see the reference in the article. And the working alliance measures agreement and bonding during the coaching session. It has been shown to be a mediator of cognitive change, and I was able to measure it also in my research. So if you, in other words, if you achieve a strong working alliance with your client, this will demultiply the effect of your coaching process and will enhance the emergence of insights, and it actually cascades. So not surprisingly, it has been measured as well. The more insights, the more likely the client will experience behavioral change. So it sort of builds on each other. The mediation of behavioral change on impact of the organization has not been measured. There's a lack of research for obvious reasons. because in order to experience a change at the organizational level, you need longitudinal studies, and it's typically very difficult to keep, you know, participants, research participants interested in a study for too long. So not unsurprisingly, I was not able to study the impact on the organization because my study was not longitudinal. It was only 4 months. So I had waves of, you know, clients participating, but the duration of the coaching engagement was 4 months. So I could not measure impact on the organization. However, so I could measure the working alliance and found a positive, significant relationship between the coaching behaviors and the working alliance. And what's amazing is that I thought that only the empathic behaviors were going to produce the working alliance. So I ran some multiple regression only with the empathic behaviors. That was the first component, and the transformational learning process, which was my second component. And actually, I found that even if you are not empathetic as a coach, and you just go through the transformational learning process, you will still achieve working alliance. So that actually scares me a little bit, because it may mean that robots can do it, right? Because if you say, yeah, if there is no empathic need to, I mean, there is, but you can still achieve working alliance with just the transformational learning concept. So that's interesting. Now, to measure cognitive change, I use the serendipity quotient developed by Marquis, which measure the number of serendipitous connection in the brain, so insights, the number of insights. And I also found a positive, significant relationship between the scale and the serendipity quotient. Now, when I measured empathy against the serendipity quotient, I found no relationship. So it was all due to the transformational learning process. In other words, if you are just being an empathetic coach, if you don't go through a structured professional transformational learning process, you are not going to achieve creativity. So, and especially in the case of this study, where the organization was so prevalent, you know, in the transformational learning process, you cannot be an effective coach if you are just a good listener of emotions, a good transcriber of emotions. So those who say you can be an effective executive coach without business knowledge, I think are mistaken. You cannot be a good executive coach if you are not aware of business. Likewise, you cannot be an effective executive coach if you are not an empathetic coach, which requires working on yourself. So that has been a long debate in coaching, whether psychologists could suddenly become executive coaches. And there was research in both directions, you know, proving one direction, the other direction. My research sort of lined up with those who say an executive coach has to have both. So that lined up with it. Now, if I look at behavioral change, unfortunately, so I measured it with a goal attainment. It was positive, which should have been in there, but on the slide, but it was not significant, which means in statistical language, I was not completely sure it could not have been due to chance, the way I run. So what it told me that, first of all, maybe my study was short duration. So maybe there was not really time for the coaching process to impact. That being said, the participant of the study did experience behavioral change, but probably not from the coach. And so it's possible that the coach may not have such big role in actually goal attainment, but rather it's after the client has had the insights, they then bring it to the workplace and other forces are in place and happen. Because in this particular study, they did achieve their goals. most of them achieved their goals. So it was maybe not because of the coach. And again, you know, putting this in perspective, these executives know how to set goals and to achieve goals, you know, so they may not need the coach for this. So it was also for me a call for humility, you know. Once I've done my job creating new insights, who am I, you know, to interject into exactly, you know, how they should do it. So that has helped me also in my own practice. Now, let me stop here before we go into the how to do it, to see if there are any more questions.
Yeah, we have one question from Manuela, who says, what business experience does the coach actually need? Is it more the position or the industry that the client is working in?
No, that's a very good question. I think that from my research, it was more, I mean, there was a need for organizational development knowledge. So really, how do organizations function? Industry knowledge, I think, is useful. Functional knowledge is useful. It doesn't have to go as much in depth as the organizational development knowledge. So really understanding how an organization functions. In my discussion with the focus groups, struck me as more important as, you know, how does marketing work in particular, how does the airline industry work. However, they wanted at least, I guess what they wanted is that not having to teach their coach what their industry is or what their function is, and that idea that the coach need to check, you know, there was that important behavior, checking if your understanding is sufficient, because then you go and you do your homework, you know.
Yes, as Armel has said, how do you know as a coach that you have the experience needed?
You ask.
Okay.
You do ask. You do ask. And you know, sometimes I find myself in situations where I work with a client who is in an industry that I don't know very well at all. And so we have a very frank discussion at the beginning, and I say, well, you know, I have a very basic knowledge about your industry. And as we talk about your goal, I really, as we talk about, about your job, I want you to alert me if there is something I should know. and then I will learn it. So, you know, just a funny example. I worked with a person who is in the automotive industry and in the transmission, you know, he was leading a business unit around transmission. I had no idea what it was. So after our contracting, you know, we had that discussion. He actually gave me a link to a website, and I did my homework. I read, you know, 5 or 6 pages, and then I came back and I knew what he was talking about. So sometimes that's all it takes, you know.
Thank you, Hélène. There's no further questions at this point.
Okay, so now let's go to a part that, so if only I can move to the next one. Yeah. So this, for me, is in the making, because my research was really about highlighting these behaviors. Now I'm in the second stage where I am trying to make it work. And I'm doing this in 2 ways. So first of all, I'm writing a book for practitioners. And second of all, I'm just about to launch an action research with some coaches. And actually, Joe, what I might do is to send the research advertisement, because I'm still recruiting coaches, if anybody on this call is interested. The idea being that I want to refine the process of asking the client for feedback. So I know what to ask, roughly, what the client can ask, but I'm still searching what's the best way to do it. But I have some ideas already. Why? Because first of all, I have tried it with my own clients. And secondly, there is a lot of literature in related disciplines, because other disciplines such as psychotherapy, sports coaching actually use, so it's called patient or client, or it's called student or athletes feedback, not client feedback, but it's been around for a long time. So there's a lot of literature that is available, which can be transposed to coaching. So I'm going to talk to that. The first thing that came up is the importance of contracting and informing your client. And the very first thing I put on this slide is explain your espoused theory of coaching. Because honestly, if you're not a pragmatic coach, feedback is going to look different. And I'm not saying there's no feedback in a positivist theory or in a postmodernist theory of coaching, but if you are a pragmatist, it's going to make things easier. So I think the first step is think of yourself, who am I as a coach? What's my espoused theory? And does it give a space to client feedback? So if you're not sure, there is literature about coaching theory. I can share a few names right now. So if I actually go on the chat box myself, I'm going to write down Simon Western. Then there is David Drake. There is Tatiana Bashkirova. And there is Richard Kilberg and Anthony Grant. So these are my favorite coaching theorists, and they will give you a sample of the different coaching theories that are out there, and so that you can relate it to your own. It's important to place yourself in a coaching theory. Now, once you have explained your theory of coaching to your client, you are going to empower your client accordingly. And in the pragmatic tradition, you are going to share the business case. So sort of the slide, that I gave you before, why is client feedback important? The clients probably don't want to hear everything I said, but I think that one of the main arguments in research has been that it has been shown that if clients give you feedback, trust is going to be increased and the outcome is going to be increased. And also there will be transfer of learning from your client, from you to your client. The more you share about, you discuss your coaching technique, the more the client is able to bring it home. So there's a strong argument. Model it in the sense that two things. For yourself, when you do or don't do something, sometimes it's good to step back and use it as a teaching moment and say to your client, have you thought of using this with one of your direct reports, for example? And what happens a lot for me is that, I've got a client rambling about a difficult employee and how they can't manage their commitment. And suddenly we are talking about his or her own commitment to do something. And I say, well, let's step back and see how we got to strengthening your commitment. What did I do to strengthen your commitment? Would that be applicable with your own employee or direct report? And they make the connection between what I do as a coach and what they do as a manager coach. So that's another way, you know, to enable client feedback. And the other way, of course, is to give feedback to your client yourself using a formative method. So one of my favorite formative methods is the Center for Creative Leadership method, which they call SBI, Situation Behavior Impact. It explains, you know, it reiterates the situation, names the behavior, and explain how it impacted you or someone else. So for example, you know, during that meeting, when you interrupted me, I felt insecure, and therefore I wasn't able to deliver the rest of my presentation safely, and then exploring the consequences of that. So if you give that sort of feedback to your client, chances are they are going to give you the same sort of feedback, which is exactly the sort of feedback that we need. So these are some of the thoughts I have about enabling client feedback. Now, collecting and using client feedback during practice. This is tricky because if you think of a coaching session goes rather quickly. We're usually pressed by time. So an objection might be, well, you know, we have so much to do. And it's not for the client, it's for me. So I feel a little bit, you know, unsure. So actually make it not for you and make it for the client, which you can do in the enabling part. So that's going to help. And secondly, there are best practices in related disciplines. So let me share the example of sports coaching, where coaches use a process of feedback after each important game, where the students are asked to, or the athletes are asked to fill a survey, and then they discuss it together with their coach. And it is a behavioral survey. So, you know, what did the coach, to what extent did your coach did X, Y, Z? And then they discuss and link it to the outcome of the game. And the coach goes away with a thing that they can improve for next time. But they don't do it every time. They do it for important games. So that's one example. Another example is psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is a little bit more difficult because in that case, the client is really difficult for them to do in-depth behavioral feedback because we go into, you know, some medical knowledge. It's as much as the client in executive coaching is knowledgeable about what to do, you do. A patient in the context of a clinical setting is not necessarily knowledgeable about what the doctor does, right? So it's a little bit more difficult. But they have implemented outcome feedback, very, very simple tool that the client can use at any moment of the conversation. The therapist will say, okay, I've got 4 questions to ask you. And please, you know, let me know to what extent you experience this and this and that. And then the therapist can decide on another course of action, right? So it's an example where if we were able to build a very, very short survey of like I need to check on these 3 or 4 behaviors, it could be done, given to the client and say, okay, push button now. And you know, there are platforms. So for example, I have a client who uses Slack. Slack is an app where actually people can give you feedback instantaneously. And so during, you know, these are group coaching sessions. And at 4 points during the group coaching sessions, we stop and the client gives feedback about the dynamic of the group using Slack. So it can be done with the appropriate platform. So from time to time or during the session. This is going to be the topic of my action research, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, I would encourage you to experiment. You know, even if you are not participating in my research, you should experiment. But the most important thing is contract and also inform your client about which behaviors you are going to be asking feedback on and why they are important, because that's going to help them too. Cultural differences, there's very little research about it. The good news is that my research was completely international, so I had 63 different nationalities participating, and I ran a few analyses. I didn't see any major differences, you know, between the nationalities of the participant, but again, you know, there are different view of the coach in different cultures, and so you just want to make sure that you build it up in a way that's acceptable to the culture where you work. Asian cultures, you know, clients may tend to be more deferent to the coach, and so you're going to need to break that barrier. And US culture, they will be might be very much in your face from the start, and so that might actually be a good place to try and solicit feedback from. So
okay. Could I just interrupt you, Hélène? Could you move the slide forward? I think we're a slide behind.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. That is helpful. Here we go. So these are the relative discipline, and you will see some reference to it in my article. And the cultural differences, very little research, if not at all, but this is something that we need to pay attention to. Self-reflective practice. This is the moment where you as a coach need to put together what you heard from your clients in terms of formative feedback and some of the data that you have about the summative feedback. Some of it can be done during the session, but I think at the end of the day, you're going to have to do your homework, step back, and really think about what happened. And my recommendation is, from time to time, tape a coaching session with the permission of your client, obviously, and by prefacing and telling them, you know, I tape my coaching session from time to time. Would you be okay with that? I speak from experience. When I mentor coaches for SEC level, especially, I request tapes. And if they don't give me tapes, I do not mentor them. I ask them to talk to another mentor, because I think when you are at the beginning of your coaching journey, I am not going to trust myself. I'm going to trust the client, and I want to listen to the client and how things happen. So one thought for you, even if you're no longer a beginner coach, from time to time, taping a session will go a long way. Finally, some thoughts about using client feedback in supervision. So I mentioned to you, most supervisors follow a model of supervision. I just completed a survey of the supervision literature for the Graduate Alliance of Coaching in Education. I have the privilege of being co-chair of the research committee, and we are in the process of revising the standards used to accreditate schools, universities that teach coaching. And we started with the standard of supervision, and what we found is that there is no evidence whatsoever that a particular model of supervision works, because nobody has actually engaged in research to that effect. So there are a few models out there, but none of them has been proven to be more effective or even effective at all. So your supervisor is likely to have been trained in one model. You have got to be careful that if you don't bring the client voice into your supervision sessions, you're just going to get the experience of one expert. So my recommendation would be, from time to time, bring a taped coaching session to supervision so that your supervisor can hear the client voice, because a lot of research has shown that experts' evaluation of coaching diverge from the client evaluation of coaching. If you are actually using a feedback system, sharing with your supervisor the results of the surveys. Usually I get very high ratings in that domain from my clients, or not so good in another domain. Sharing your reflective journal entries, as I said in the slide before, you engage in reflective practice. That means you are journaling your progress, so sharing that. And as I said, manage your supervisor. So if you think your supervisor is overusing a model, well, then give them feedback. If you have learned to teach your client to give feedback, then do give feedback to your supervisor. So these are some of my thoughts. So final slide is questions. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I also have a website where you can communicate with me, or you can send me an email. Joe will have that. And now I'd like to open it to questions. Also, any insights you got from this, anything that comes to mind.
So, do we have any questions for Hélène? I think as well, the questions are coming. I'd just like to share, Hélène, that what you're sharing seems, yeah, maybe pragmatism is the word that we should use, because it feels quite liberating for me to hear that, yes, we can ask if it's okay to share certain things with our clients, and also to ask for that feedback. I think it's a way that makes me feel comfortable about seeing if we're still aligned with our client and if the client's getting what they want on an ongoing basis, without having to wait till the end maybe of a coaching contract. Yeah. So that's good, yeah. But so any questions? Please type them in the chat box, or we can now maybe unmute people if you have questions to ask directly. I have a question here from Manuela, who would say apparently she lost her connection for a moment. So would you mind resharing the steps of a sports coach? Maybe that's something you could actually check, Manuela, in the recording.
Yeah, so I mean, I can address it very quickly. It's at the end of an important game. So they don't do it all the time, but at the end of an important game.
Okay, any other questions? Julie says that it's very relevant to what we experience as coaches, what you've shared with us tonight. Anything else that anyone would like to ask? This is your time to ask Hélène. She's here for us.
I unmuted my microphone. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm wondering, did I understand you correctly when you say, when you ask clients for feedback, that you probably should have some kind of idea what you want feedback on? So for example, I don't know, a coach might be working on, I don't know, his or her capacity to provoke insights or to be present or whatever. So to have some kind of angle, what to ask feedback on, or should it be rather general, that kind of like a satisfaction survey or an impact survey after any kind of mission that one might do? What is your take on that? How specific should one look for things, or more general?
Well, I think it's a great question, Gabriela, and I would say it depends on your espoused theory of coaching. For me, as a pragmatist, I would probably engage the client to tell me first what they want to give me feedback on, and based on, you know, how we have shared evidence at the beginning. So at the beginning, so just to give you an example how I do it, I told you an entire session is about contracting. So I spend an hour contracting. Now what I'm starting to do during that hour is to explain the coaching process, especially if the client has never been coached before. If the client has been coached before, I ask them how they define the coaching process. And that allows me to mention a few behaviors. Say, you'll see me do this. So it's important that if it works for you or doesn't work for you, you let me know. That's how I've been experimenting with it, right? And so I am not too concerned upfront about my own development. Of course, if I see after 3 or 4 clients that the same thing is recurring, then I'm going to start getting suspicious and ask the 5th client about the same thing, because I'm like, oh, maybe there's a pattern. And I'm probably going to make you smile, but if my supervisor points something out, I'm probably going to wait to see if the client comes up with it before I present it, because, you know, I've been working with my supervisor for a long time, and we know each other very well. And sometimes she'll give me advice, right, which is absolutely fine. And sometimes I think, well, I want to see what my clients have to say about it. I'm going to let them tell me whether or not this is something I should work on. So I'm very, very pragmatic in my approach. But, you know, if you're coming from a different perspective and you really want to work on a specific behavior, you can ask your client, but remember, it may not matter to them. It may not be important in the coaching context, because every coaching is different. Every single coaching is different. Within a coaching engagement, every session is different. The first half and the second half might be different. So it's this idea of eclecticism. You know, you can never know how things are going to unfold. But it could be really anything. It could be very general, or it could be very specific. And again, ground it into your coaching approach. You know, your chosen theory of coaching. I hope that helps. So maybe more confusing than helping. But
is that okay, Gabriella? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions for Hélène? Nothing coming through the chat so far?
Yeah, so I have one question for you guys, because that's always how I end you know, any training. We can use a chat box for that, but what's your key learning from this? You just spent an hour and a half. I hope it was productive. What's your key learning? I'm just curious. You can either speak, or I don't know, Joe, what you think is most appropriate. What's the key thing you've learned?
You can either use the chat box, or you can unmute yourself if we can manage this. Yeah, we go ahead. So we have Julie saying that the learning is that the client is at the center of everything we do. Not giving babysitting objectives, which I fully agree with, as executives can make decisions. Yeah. I need to read up on different coaching theories and decide which one I feel most comfortable with. Thank you. So, Christy. Anybody want to unmute themselves to say what they're taking away from this session? So Gabriella says the key learning, apart from permission to share content, if okay with the client, is to actually go out and experiment with getting client feedback. Yeah.
Great.
Manuela, I wonder if I should share with you as a question to the client, and also contracting. Yes, I agree with that, that it's reinforced the message we had not too long ago from another coach about contracting, the actual importance of spending enough time on that. Okay, I think that nothing else coming through the chat box. So if nobody is going to unmute themselves, maybe we can bring the webinar to a close, Hélène.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to come and present these findings.
Well, I think it's really for us to thank you for taking the time to share your research with us, which is absolutely fascinating to maybe give us permission to actually go out and experiment, as Gabriella says, getting feedback directly from our clients in the moment, and I think that can only strengthen the relationship that we have with our clients, and checking that what we're doing is actually working for them, which is what it's all about. So thank you so much. Thank you.